Chapter 6. Before I proceed any further, common decency requires me to reassure my readers concerning my intentions, which, heaven knows, are far from flippant. To separate fact from fancy has always been difficult for me, but now that I have had the honor to be chosen Secretary of the Zoological Gardens in Bronx Park, I realize keenly that unless I give up writing fiction, nobody will believe what I write about science. Therefore, it is to a serious and unimaginative public that I shall hereafter address myself, and I do it in the modest confidence that I shall neither be distrusted nor doubted, although, unfortunately, I still write in that irrational style which suggests covert frivolity, and for which I am undergoing a course of treatment in English literature at Columbia College. Now, having promised to avoid originality and confine myself to facts, I shall tell what I have to tell concerning the dingo, the mammoth, and something else. For some weeks, it had been rumored that Professor Farrago, president of the Bronx Park Zoological Society, would resign to accept an enormous salary as manager of Barnum and Bailey's circus. He was now with the circus in London, and had promised to cable his decision before the day was over. I hoped he would decide to remain with us. I was his secretary and particular favorite, and I viewed without enthusiasm the advent of a new president who might shake us all out of our congenial and carefully excavated ruts. However, it was plain that the trustees of the society expected the resignation of Professor Farrago, for they had been in secret session all day, considering the names of possible candidates to fill Professor Farrago's large, old-fashioned shoes. These preparations worried me, for I could scarcely expect another chief as kind and considerate as Professor Leonidas Farrago. That afternoon, in June, I left my office in the administration building in Bronx Park and strolled out under the trees for a breath of air. But the heat of the sun soon drove me to seek shelter under a little square arbor, a shady retreat covered with purple wisteria and honeysuckle. As I entered the arbor, I noticed that there were 3 other people seated there: an elderly lady with masculine features and short hair, a younger lady sitting beside her, and, farther away, a rough-looking young man reading a book. For a moment, I had an indistinct impression of having met the elder lady somewhere, and under circumstances not entirely agreeable. But beyond a stony and indifferent glance, she paid no attention to me. As for the younger lady, she did not look at me at all. She was very young, with pretty eyes, a mass of silky brown hair, and a skin as fresh as a rose which had just been rained on. With that delicacy peculiar to lonely scientific bachelors, I modestly sat down beside the rough young man, although there was more room beside the younger lady. Some lazy loafer reading a penny dreadful, I thought, glancing at him, then at the title of his book. Hearing me beside him, he turned round and blinked over his shabby shoulder, and the movement uncovered the page he had been silently conning. The volume in his hands was Darwin's famous monograph on the monodactyl. He noticed the astonishment on my face and smiled uneasily, shifting the short clay pipe in his mouth. "I guess," he observed, "that this here book is too much for me, mister." "It's rather technical," I replied, smiling. "Yes," he said, in vague admiration. "It's fierce, ain't it?" After a silence, I asked him if he would tell me why he had chosen Darwin as a literary pastime. "Well," he said placidly, "I was trying to read about animals, but I'm up against a word slinger this time, all right. Now here's a gum twister," and he painfully spelled out monodactyl, breathing hard all the while. "Monodactyl," I said, "means a single-toed creature." He turned the page with alacrity. "Is that the beast he's talking about?" he asked. The illustration he pointed out was a woodcut representing Darwin's reconstruction of the dingo from the fossil bones in the British Museum. It was a well-executed woodcut, showing the dingo in the foreground, and, to give scale, a mammoth in the middle distance. "Yes," I replied, "that is the dingo." "I've seen one," he observed calmly. I smiled and explained that the dingo had been extinct for some thousands of years. "Oh, I guess not," he replied with cool optimism. Then he placed a grimy forefinger on the mammoth. "I've seen them things, too," he remarked. Again I patiently pointed out his error, and suggested that he referred to an elephant. "Elephant be blowed," he replied scornfully. "I guess I know what I seen. And I seen that there thing you call a dingo, too." Not wishing to prolong a futile discussion, I remained silent. After a moment, he wheeled around, removing his pipe from his hard mouth. "Did you ever hear tell of Graham's Glacier?" he demanded. "Certainly," I replied, astonished. "It's the southernmost glacier in British America." "Right," he said. "And did you ever hear tell of the Hudson Mountains, mister?" "Yes," I replied. "What's behind 'em?" he snapped out. "Nobody knows," I answered. "They are considered impassable." "They ain't, though," he said doggedly. "I've been behind 'em." "Really?" I replied, tiring of his yarn. "Yes, really," he replied sullenly. Then he began to fumble and search through the pages of his book until he found what he wanted. "Mister," he said, "just read that out loud, please." The passage he indicated was the famous chapter beginning, "Is the mammoth extinct? Is the dingo extinct? Probably. And yet the aborigines of British America maintain the contrary. Probably both the mammoth and the dingo are extinct, but until expeditions have penetrated and explored not only the unknown region in Alaska, but also that hidden tableland beyond the Graham Glacier and the Hudson Mountains, it will not be possible to definitely announce the total extinction of either the mammoth or the dingo." When I had read it, slowly for his benefit, he brought his hand down smartly on one knee and nodded rapidly. "Mister," he said, "that gent knows a thing or two, and don't you forget it." Then he demanded, abruptly, how I knew he hadn't been behind the Graham Glacier. I explained. "Shucks," he said, "there's a road 5 miles wide into that there tableland, mister, and I ain't been in New York long. I came into port a week ago on the Arctic Belle whaler. I was in the Hudson Range when that there Graham Glacier bust up." "What?" I exclaimed. "Didn't you know it?" he asked. "Well, maybe it ain't in the papers, but it busted all right, blowed up by an earthquake and volcano combined. Mister, it was orful. My, how I did run." "Do you mean to tell me that some convulsion of the earth has shattered the Graham Glacier?" I asked. "Convulsions? Yes, and fits, too," he said sulkily. "The whole blame thing dropped into a hole, and say, mister, home and mother's good enough for me now." I stared at him stupidly. "Once," he said, "I catched pelts for them sharps at Hudson Bay, like any yaller husky, but the things I seen after that convulsion fit, the things I seen behind the Hudson Mountains, don't make me hanker after no life on the prairie wild. Let me tell you, I may be a mother carry chicken, but this chicken has got enough." After a long silence, I picked up his book again and pointed at the picture of the mammoth. "What color is it?" I asked. "Kind of red and brown," he answered promptly. "It's woolly, too." Astounded, I pointed to the dingo. "One-toed," he said quickly. "Makes a noise like a bell when scuttering about." Intensely excited, I laid my hand on his arm. "My society will give you $1,000, I said, "if you pilot me inside the Hudson tableland and show me either a mammoth or a dingo." He looked me calmly in the eye. "Mister," he said slowly, "have you got $1 million for to squander on me?" "No," I said suspiciously. "Because," he went on, "it wouldn't be enough. Home and mother suits me now." He picked up his book and rose. In vain I asked his name and address. In vain I begged him to dine with me, to become my honored guest. "Not," he said shortly, and shambled off down the path. But I was not going to lose him like that. I rose and deliberately started to stalk him. It was easy. He shuffled along, pulling on his pipe, and I after him. It was growing a little dark, although the sun still reddened the tops of the maples. Afraid of losing him in the falling dusk, I once more approached him and laid my hand upon his ragged sleeve. "Look here," he cried out, wheeling about. "I want you to quit following me. Don't I tell you, money can't make me go back to them mountains." And as I attempted to speak, he suddenly tore off his cap and pointed to his head. His hair was white as snow. "That's what come of monkeying into your cursed mountains," he shouted fiercely. "There's things in there what no Christian oughter see. Let me alone or I'll bust yer." He shambled on, doubled fists swinging by his side. The next moment, setting my teeth obstinately, I followed him and caught him by the park gate. At my hail, he whirled round with a snarl, but I grabbed him by the throat and backed him violently against the park wall. "You invaluable ruffian," I said. "Now you listen to me. I live in that big stone building, and I'll give you $1,000 to take me behind the Grand Glacier. Think it over, and call on me when you are in a pleasanter frame of mind. If you don't come by noon tomorrow, I'll go to the Grand Glacier without you." He was attempting to kick me all the time, but I managed to avoid him, and when I had finished, I gave him a shove which almost loosened his spinal column. He went reeling out across the sidewalk, and when he had recovered his breath and his balance, he danced with displeasure and displayed a vocabulary that astonished me. However, he kept his distance. As I turned back into the park, satisfied that he would not follow, the first person I saw was the elderly, stony-faced lady of the wisteria arbor advancing on tiptoe. Behind her came the younger lady with cheeks like a rose that had been rained on. Instantly, it occurred to me they had followed us, and at the same moment I knew who the stony-faced lady was. Angry but polite, I lifted my hat and saluted her, and she, probably furious at having been caught tiptoeing after me, cut me dead. The younger lady passed me with face averted, but even in the dusk I could see the tip of one little ear turn scarlet. Walking on hurriedly, I entered the administration building and found Professor Lessard of the reptilian department preparing to leave. "Don't you do it," I said sharply. "I've got exciting news." "I'm only going to the theater," he replied. "It's a good show. Adam and Eve. There's a snake in it, you know. It's in my line." "I can't help it," I said, and I told him briefly what had occurred in the arbor. "But that's not all," I continued savagely. "Those women followed us, and who do you think one of them turned out to be? Well, it was Professor Small of Barnard College, and I'll bet every pair of boots I own that she starts for the Grand Glacier within a week." "Idiot that I was!" I exclaimed, smiting my head with both hands. "I never recognized her until I saw her tiptoeing and craning her neck to listen. Now she knows about the glacier. She heard every word that young ruffian said, and she'll go to the glacier if it's only to forestall me." Professor Lessard looked anxious. He knew that Miss Small, professor of natural history at Barnard College, had long desired an appointment at the Bronx Park Gardens. It was even said she had a chance of succeeding Professor Farrago as president, but that, of course, must have been a joke. However, she haunted the gardens, annoying the keepers by persistently poking the animals with her umbrella. On one occasion, she sent us word that she desired to enter the tiger's enclosure for the purpose of making experiments in hypnotism. Professor Farrago was absent, but I took it upon myself to send back word that I feared the tigers might injure her. The miserable small boy who took my message informed her that I was afraid she might injure the tigers, and the unpleasant incident almost cost me my position. "I am quite convinced," said I to Professor Lessard, "that Miss Small is perfectly capable of abusing the information she overheard, and of starting herself to explore a region that, by all the laws of decency, justice, and prior claim, belongs to me." "Well," said Lessard, with a peculiar laugh, "it's not certain whether you can go at all." "Professor Farrago will authorize me," I said confidently. "Professor Farrago has resigned," said Lessard. It was a bolt from a clear sky. Good heavens, I blurted out. What will become of the rest of us then? I don't know, he replied. The trustees are holding a meeting over in the administration building to elect a new president for us. It depends on the new president what becomes of us. Lessard, I said hoarsely, you don't suppose that they could possibly elect Miss Small as our president, do you? He looked at me askance and bit his cigar. I'd be in a nice position, wouldn't I? Said I, anxiously. The lady would probably make you walk the plank for that tiger business, he replied. But I didn't do it, I protested with sickly eagerness. Besides, I explained to her. He said nothing, and I stared at him, appalled by the possibility of reporting to Professor Small for instructions next morning. See here, Lessard, I said nervously, I wish you would step over to the administration building and ask the trustees if I may prepare for this expedition. Will you? He glanced at me sympathetically. It was quite natural for me to wish to secure my position before the new president was elected, especially as there was a chance of the new president being Miss Small. You are quite right, he said. The Graham Glacier would be the safest place for you if our next president is to be the Lady of the Tigers. And he started across the park, puffing his cigar. I sat down on the doorstep to wait for his return, not at all charmed with the prospect. It made me furious, too, to see my ambition nipped with the frost of a possible veto from Miss Small. If she is elected, thought I, there is nothing for me but to resign, to avoid the inconvenience of being shown the door. Oh, I wish I had allowed her to hypnotize the tigers. The thought of crime flitted through my mind. Miss Small would not remain president, or anything else very long, if she persisted in her desire for the tigers. And then, when she called for help, I would pretend not to hear. Aroused from criminal meditation by the return of Professor Lessard, I jumped up and peered into his perplexed eyes. They've elected a president, he said, but they won't tell us who the president is until tomorrow. You don't think, I stammered. I don't know. But I know this. The new president sanctions the expedition to the Graham Glacier and directs you to choose an assistant and begin preparations for 4 people. Overjoyed, I seized his hand and said, Hooray! In a voice weak with emotion. The old dragon isn't elected this time, I added triumphantly. By the way, he said, who is the other dragon with her in the park this evening? I described her in a more modulated voice. Whew, observed Professor Lessard. That must be her assistant, Professor Dorothy Van Twiller. She's the prettiest blue stocking in town. With this curious remark, my confrere followed me into my room and wrote down the list of articles I dictated to him. The list included a complete camping equipment for myself and 3 other men. Am I one of those other men? Inquired Lessard, with an unhappy smile. Before I could reply, my door was shoved open, and a figure appeared at the threshold, cap in hand. What do you want? I asked sternly, but my heart was beating high with triumph. The figure shuffled. Then came a subdued voice. Mister, I guess I'll go back to the Graham Glacier along with you. I'm Billy Spike, and it kinder scares me to go back to them Hudson Mountains, but somehow, mister, when you choked me and kinder walked me off my ear, why, mister, I kinder took to you like. There was absolute silence for a minute. Then he said, So if you go, I guess I'll go too, mister. For $1,000? For nothing, he muttered, or what you like. All right, Billy, I said briskly. Just look over those rifles and ammunition and see that everything's sound. He slowly lifted his tough young face and gave me a dog-like glance. They were hard eyes, but there was gratitude in them. You'll get your throat slit, whispered Lessard. Not while Billy's with me, I replied cheerfully. Late that night, as I was preparing for pleasant dreams, a knock came on my door, and a telegraph messenger handed me a note, which I read, shivering in my bare feet, although the thermometer marked 80 Fahrenheit. You will leave immediately for the Hudson Mountains via Wellman Bay, Labrador, there to await further instructions. Equipment for yourself and 1 assistant will include following articles. Here began a list of camping utensils, scientific paraphernalia, and provisions. The steamer Penguin sails at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. Kindly find yourself on board at that hour. Any excuse for not complying with these orders will be accepted as your resignation. Susan Small, President, Bronx Zoological Society. "Lessard!" I shouted, trembling with fury. He appeared at his door, chastely draped in pajamas, and he read the insolent letter with terrified alacrity. "What are you going to do? Resign?" he asked, much frightened. "Do?" I snarled, grinding my teeth. "I'm going. That's what I'm going to do." But you can't get ready and catch that steamer, too," he stammered. He did not know me.